Mr. Secretary, you've talked a lot about winning. You've talked about winning in your testimony today. You've talked about winning throughout the Iran war, and we all like winning. But I think the American people deserve a definition of what it means to win in Iran.
Militarily, their capabilities are nowhere near ours. I would take issue with your characterization that we started this war. Iran started this war 47 years ago, and they've killed thousands of Americans, including our brothers on the battlefield in Iraq.
They think that means the war is going to come to an end because we've won. And the president said back in March that we'd won. So clearly that is not the case based on your testimony today. It's also a fact that the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, testified in front of the Intelligence Committee that it was our assessment that Iran did not intend to restart its nuclear program.
Pete Hegseth says the U.S. has crushed Iran militarily. But when Senator Chris Van Hollen asked the most basic question, what does winning actually mean? The answer got a lot more complicated.
We recently lost 3 American heroes. That brings the death toll for American soldiers to 18. 1 is still missing. Hundreds have been injured. That's on top of the civilian death toll throughout the region that now stands at several thousand, including the over 150 people killed in the bombing of an elementary school in Minab in Iran. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Gas prices today in the United States again spiked above $4 a gallon. And that will also continue to push up costs for groceries and other things that families buy. Secretary Hegseth, you said in your opening statement the best way to ensure peace is to prepare for war, and I agree with you about deterrence. I would also submit that the best way to ensure peace is not to start wars, because wars are a lot easier to start than they are to end. General Kane, I heard your testimony saying Iran will continue to be a challenge. And I think it's pretty clear that that is, in fact, the case. And, General, in order for you to develop a military strategy to accomplish a particular objective, you obviously need to know what those objectives are, right?
Yes, sir. It all starts with what is the political objective, and from that we derive military objectives that support whatever that end state is.
And as you say, that is a political objective.
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Secretary, you've talked a lot about winning. You've talked about winning in your testimony today. You've talked about winning throughout the Iran war, and we all like winning. But I think the American people deserve a definition of what it means to win in Iran.
On August 7th, a U.S. official said negotiations involving Iran and Oman were making progress toward an agreement that could allow commercial shipping through the strait to resume without impediments, but no final deal had been announced at that point.
Because this war has dragged out for a lot longer than certainly the President of the United States indicated. Indeed, the President said on March 24th, and I'm quoting, "We've won this war. This war has been won." Do you know what the President meant by that back in March?
Well, Senator, I would just note that militarily, I mean, Iran has been completely overmatched and crushed from the beginning, militarily. Their capabilities are nowhere near ours. I would take issue with your characterization that we started this war. Iran started this war 47 years ago, and they've killed thousands of Americans, including our brothers on the battlefield in Iraq. Iran has been targeting us for a long time.
Mr. Secretary,
we didn't start it, they did.
Let me just ask you this, since you said that what the President meant by his statement on March 24th, I think that we had sort of defeated Iran militarily. But that is not the entire objective of this war. I don't think there was ever a question about whether the United States, with its superior military, could destroy a lot of Iranian assets, military assets or other assets. That was never a question. But when most people think of winning the war, they think that that means the war is going to come to an end because we've won. And the President said back in March that we'd won. So I guess my question to you is, how are we going to define winning? I hear back in March, you said about the Iranians, and I quote, whether they will have a ceremony in Tehran Square and surrender, that's up to them. So my question, Mr. Secretary, reopening the Strait of Hormuz is necessary in order for us to win, right?
In July, shipping through Hormuz remained severely disrupted. Reuters reported that only a fraction of normal traffic was getting through, and attacks on commercial vessels prompted maritime authorities to raise the transit threat level to severe. The strait remains one of the central pressure points in the conflict.
It's just a simple yes or no question.
You asked me what the overarching objective is, and I would say ensuring Iran never has a nuclear weapon. That's been clear from the president from day one. That's why Midnight Hammer was undertaken, to obliterate their nuclear sites. That's why we're watching their nuclear sites. That's why that was a part of negotiations, ensuring that the next generation of Americans don't have to deal with an Iran that wields a nuclear weapon.
Since that's what you're leading with, Mr. Secretary, let me just say this. You said, after Midnight Hammer, and I'm quoting, our bombing campaign obliterated Iran's ability to create nuclear weapons, unquote. Clearly, that is not the case based on your testimony today. It's also a fact that the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, testified in front of the Intelligence Committee that it was our assessment that Iran did not intend to restart its nuclear program. The President of the United States, just about a week ago, said Iran has committed not to develop a nuclear weapon, which of course is a commitment they've made for many years. We need to enforce that. That's what we are doing under the JCPOA. Thank you.
The Iran war has moved well beyond the situation discussed in the July 21st Senate hearing. On July 21st, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told senators that the war had already cost the United States about $37.5 billion, while the administration was seeking another $88 billion in supplemental funding, including roughly $67 billion tied directly to the Iran conflict. The hearing also came as lawmakers questioned the administration's changing description of what winning the war actually means. Since that hearing, the situation around the Strait of Hormuz has remained one of the central problems of the conflict. On July 13th, the United States announced that it was reinstating its blockade of Iranian ports and shipping after the collapse of a 60-day arrangement. U.S. forces subsequently resumed strikes, while attacks and disruptions involving commercial shipping continued to threaten the crucial oil route. As of August 7th, however, there was a significant diplomatic development. U.S. officials said negotiations involving Iran and Oman were making progress toward an agreement that could allow commercial shipping through the strait to resume. The proposed arrangement remained conditional, and the United States said any lifting of its blockade would depend on Iran fulfilling its commitments. That latest development makes Senator Chris Van Hollen's questioning on July 21st even more important. He was not simply asking whether the United States had destroyed Iranian military assets. His central challenge was much harder. What does victory actually mean? Hegseth could point to Iran's military losses and the destruction of nuclear-related facilities, but Van Hollen was looking for an objective end state that the American public could understand. If the war is described as won while American forces remain deployed, the strait remains contested, billions more dollars are requested, and negotiations are still necessary, then the administration has to explain what condition would actually allow Americans to say the war is over. That is the key weakness exposed during the exchange. Military superiority and strategic victory are not necessarily the same thing. The United States can possess overwhelming firepower and still face a difficult political problem if the opponent remains capable of disrupting shipping, threatening regional stability, and forcing Washington to spend additional resources. Hegseth emphasized Iran's inability to match the United States militarily, but Van Hollen was asking about the political objective that comes after military operations. The Strait of Hormuz is a perfect example. Before the conflict, the strategic importance of the waterway was obvious. It is one of the world's most important routes for energy shipments. During the war, however, the strait became not simply a military objective, but an economic pressure point. When shipping is disrupted, the consequences reach far beyond the battlefield. Oil prices, transportation costs, insurance, manufacturing, and household expenses can all be affected. That means the definition of success cannot be limited to how many Iranian targets were destroyed. And this is where the July 21st hearing becomes especially relevant to what happened afterward. The administration was asking Congress for tens of billions of additional dollars, while lawmakers were still trying to determine the war's ultimate objective. If the goal was preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, then lawmakers needed to know how that objective would be verified. If reopening the strait was another essential objective, then the government needed to explain how that would be achieved without creating an open-ended military commitment. Van Hollen also challenged Hegseth over the administration's earlier claim that the U.S. bombing campaign had obliterated Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons. The senator pointed to intelligence testimony suggesting that Iran had not been assessed as immediately preparing to restart its nuclear program. Hegseth maintained that preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon remained the administration's central objective. That disagreement goes directly to the credibility of the government's public messaging. Destroying infrastructure is one thing. Permanently eliminating the possibility of rebuilding a nuclear capability is another. The subsequent developments show why that distinction matters. The United States and Iran have continued to require diplomacy even after extensive military action. The fact that Oman is now involved in negotiations over the strait demonstrates that military power alone has not resolved the strategic problem. A negotiated reopening would not necessarily mean the military campaign failed, but it would show that the final outcome depends on diplomacy as well as force. There's also the issue of cost. At $37.5 billion already spent by July 21st, the financial question was no longer theoretical. Hegseth argued that additional money was necessary to replenish weapons, maintain readiness, and sustain operations. Critics, meanwhile, questioned whether Congress was being asked to approve enormous additional spending without receiving a sufficiently clear definition of the desired end state. That is why Van Hollen's question about winning deserves more attention than the political argument over who started the conflict. Even if one accepts the administration's argument that Iran was the aggressor, that does not answer what happens next. Wars are judged not only by the damage inflicted on an enemy, but also by whether the political objectives that justified the fighting are ultimately achieved. The latest negotiations could provide an important test. If an agreement allows commercial shipping to safely resume through the strait while creating meaningful restrictions on Iran's nuclear ambitions, the administration could argue that its military pressure helped produce a favorable outcome. But if the strait remains unstable, American troops remain exposed, and Washington continues requesting large amounts of money without a clear endpoint, lawmakers will have even more reason to demand a precise strategy. The July 21st hearing, therefore, exposed a question that remains unresolved today. Can the Trump administration define a measurable victory in Iran that goes beyond military destruction? And can it convince Congress and the American people that the additional cost and risk are justified? Do you think the United States should continue military operations until Iran's nuclear threat and the Strait of Hormuz are secured, or should Washington prioritize a negotiated settlement and bring the war to an end?